be wanting to ask you about your historical experiences, which are all over the globe. But we're going to talk about Ukraine tonight.
Good, good.
And I'd like to start with just asking you, with this map in the background, your assessment from your own visits to Ukraine of the situation there, the state of the war, the state of Ukraine's morale, the overall question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. It's great. I'm looking forward to this with the students. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Whatever you want to talk about, I'm eager to do that. You know, I'm looking at this map. This map doesn't have borders. You know, it's a little bit of a, you know, the projection is not super, but you know where Ukraine is, and you know kind of what's generally going on there. So, as the professor said, Ukraine is struggling for its life. Ukraine is defending itself, it's defending its right to exist. So in 2014, Russia, its big neighbor, again, you can't see it on this map, but you know, there it is, you can't see the borders, but there, invaded part of Ukraine, and the part of Ukraine that they invaded was, you can't see this, it's Crimea. It's this southern peninsula of, southern portion of Ukraine. And the Russians have occupied Crimea, and another part called Donbass, also outlined here. You can see those outlines, you can't see the rest, since 2014, so coming up on 10 years. And there was a low-level fighting along the line of contact since 2014, all the way through 2022. In February of 2022, the Russians assembled troops, Russian forces, all around the borders. From the north in Belarus, you can see you got Belarus here. You got, of course, the Russians here, and then on the south they had their troops in Crimea. So they were able to surround Ukraine and invade Ukraine in a surprise, a big surprise to most people, not all. We can talk about that. I mean, your CIA, you know, figured it out. Your CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C., often gets criticized, but they somehow figured it out and let people know that there was a really good chance that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine. The reason it was hard to accept was it made no sense. It made no sense for Russia to invade Ukraine because that was the understanding. The understanding for years had been, for generations, since World War II, was that nations don't invade other nations. Now this was an innovation, actually. Professor, you will probably teach this. But for a long time, up until World War II, there was no respect for sovereignty of nations, for borders. But since World War II, there was a general understanding that nations are sovereign, that national borders matter, and you don't, big nations, strong nations don't invade, don't have the right, or can't get away with invading small nations, weaker nations, until the Russians invaded Ukraine. So what's going on here are two things. One, as I say, the Ukrainians are fighting for their existence. If they lose, there won't be a Ukraine. We won't have a map of Ukraine. There won't be a map of Ukraine if the Russians win. Putin has made that very clear. He just wants to absorb, control, take back Ukraine. So this is existential in the real sense of that word for Ukraine. But the second thing that's going on is this order that had kept at least Europe from a major war since World War II, that order is challenged. Putin wants to get rid of those rules. He doesn't want to abide by it. He says those rules where you respect each other's borders, you respect sovereignty of others. He says those are American rules. He doesn't want to go by American rules. Well, of course, they apply to all of us. So what's going on right now in answer to your question, there's a long answer to your question. You gave me a general question, so I'll give you a long answer. Is the Ukrainians are fighting for their own existence. They are defending themselves, they're defending their families, their land, their nation, but they are also, at the same time, they are defending Europe. So they are what's between, Ukraine is what's between Russia and NATO, Europe, our allies. So what's going on there is the Ukrainians are part of our security. Ukrainians are fighting in some real sense on our behalf. They are, if they win, let's go the other way, if they win, we are more secure. The United States is more secure. Clearly Europe is more secure. And since we are in a strong alliance, the NATO alliance with Europeans, we are more secure because our allies are more secure. So those are the stakes, Professor. I mean, that's to get us started.
Okay, the stakes are clear, but of course, as you know well, this past summer there was a great deal of expectation and hope that the Ukrainian military offensive would make significant progress. That doesn't seem to be the case. I was wondering, you've been to Ukraine recently, wondering if you could talk about how Ukrainians see the war now.
Be glad to, yes. So since February 24th, 2022, since 19 months ago, 19 months of war, the Ukrainians have been fighting, and the Russians have been fighting, let's be clear. I've been there 5 times since, and I'll go back again in January. So I've been able to see, talk to, have good interactions with, have meetings with a lot of Ukrainians. So I have some good friends still who are in the Ukrainian military. They're in the army, and they are on these lines. And you're right. They had hoped, and a lot of American military had hoped that the Ukrainians would be able to break through these lines. In the summer, and they started off in June with an attempt, and it was terrible. It was terrible. The Russians had probably 6, 7, 8 months to prepare, while the Ukrainians were waiting for the assistance that was coming from the United States and from other European allies, but it was coming slowly. And that delay in the buildup of the Ukrainian military capabilities allowed the Russians to dig in, lay incredible mines. So one of my friends is now a lieutenant, and he leads a small unit. And their job has been to go out at night along the front line where the minefields have been laid, and the Russians have put just a dense field of mines, kilometers deep, like 2, 3, 4 kilometers deep of this. And my friend, his name's Alex Gordon, was describing this. He said within a square meter, within 1 square meter, there could be 5 mines of different kinds. Some anti-personnel mines that kind of pop up, some pressure-sensitive mines, some tripwires, some big anti-tank mines in the streets, in the roads, the paths. But the Russians had been able to prepare for this offensive. They knew what was coming. They didn't know where. The Russians didn't know where. So they mined this whole area. And so the Ukrainians are now looking at winter coming. Big snow, big storm just over this past weekend. In Russia as well as in Ukraine, in Crimea. The Russians right now, this gets to your question about the morale, the Russians have been waiting for the winter to come, waiting for it to get very cold, which it now has. For a while, the Ukrainians were lucky that the winter came a little bit late. I mean, I've been there when the winter comes early. The fall was pleasant in terms of weather, but it's cold now. And the Russians have been waiting for that change in weather to get very cold, to do what they did last winter, which is attack the electricity generation capacity of Ukraine and attack distribution, which is bad enough because that's where they get the heat and the light. It's critical for water. And I didn't realize this. So people who have been to Ukraine, anybody in this room been to Ukraine? Okay, all right, I know Helen has. The ambassador has. Is that right? Recently?
Recently.
Okay. So if you visited Kyiv, presumably you did.
Lviv.
Lviv, okay, well, Lviv has the same thing. Kyiv has even more of these very high-rise apartments. So 20, 22 stories. So no electricity means no elevators, no light, but it also means no water. So if you don't have water and you're on the 22nd floor or the 18th floor, you walk down carrying buckets and you walk back up carrying full buckets. Or you don't have water. So the Russians know this. The Russians know this. The Russians have conducted this in a brutal way, in a horrible way. The war crimes, I won't cringe. I won't make you cringe with the description. It is terrible, but that's what's going on this summer. So, answer to your question, the Ukrainians, they've been through one winter. They made it through. They've prepared. They've tried to prepare for this coming winter. They're still supporting their military. They are convinced that in the end they will win. Ukrainians don't say, I've mentioned this before, the Ukrainians don't say after the war, they say after the victory. The Ukrainians are convinced that they can win this if, they know what this if is. They're convinced they can win if they get the support from the West, from NATO and from the United States. So they are grimly determined at this point, I would say, Professor. That's the way I would describe it.
I showed the ambassador before we talked that there was a piece in today's Washington Post by a Russian writer, Mikhail Zygar, who pointed out that the Russian economy, rather than having been sort of damaged, or rather than having been undermined totally, is actually growing. That real estate prices are up, restaurants are full, the oligarchs have returned some 50 billion, and that the Gazan war has taken attention away from Ukraine. And the headline that the Post gave to this story was, "Is Putin winning?" And I wanted to ask you, do you think the situation now demonstrates that Russia is also prepared for a long war?
I think Russia is prepared for a long war. In fact, I think Russia's only strategy, Putin's only strategy, is to wait us out. Putin hopes that he can destroy the morale of the Ukrainians by bombing their electricity generation. He hopes that he can crack the Ukrainian morale, or reduce the support that the Ukrainians have for their president, for President Zelensky, and their head general, General Zaluzhny. These two men have the full support of the Ukrainians for what they're doing, leading the country and leading the military. And Putin's only strategy is to see if he can crack that, or crack the European morale, and see if he can make the Europeans stop providing the support to do, or crack ours. Try to get the Americans to stop supporting the Ukrainians. And he doesn't have a strategy other than to wait us out. He's hoping that something will happen next year, and the politics will change, and that the Americans will stop supporting the Ukrainians. And like I said, the Ukrainians know that they can win. They're convinced they can win if they get the support. And if they don't get the support, which is Putin's only hope, then that's what he's waiting on. That article, by the way, I'm glad you raised it. As I mentioned, all of that is true. The Russians are adapting to the sanctions that we've put on. They have mobilized their economy. The main reason their economy is doing as well as it is it's on a war footing. It's totally mobilized and is drafting people. Now, the first draft that President Putin instituted last fall was only a partial draft. He didn't totally mobilize. When he announced it in October, 1 million Russians fled the country. 1 million Russians went into Georgia and to Kazakhstan and to Dubai. And those million were the kinds of people he needs. They are the young people, the educated people, and the technically skilled people that he needs. So he's made a mistake by this invasion. He knows he's made a mistake. He's pushing the economy to do it, to push it through. One last thing, just on the comparison of the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have the support of all of Europe, the European Union, the Brits, all of Europe. He's got the support of all of North America. He's got the United States and Canada. He's got South Korea. He's got Japan. He's got Australia. He's got New Zealand. He's got the West and the bulk of the economic strength, power, GDP of the West. Putin can buy weapons from two countries, North Korea and Iran. The size of the economics base that he has is 1 to 20 compared to what the Ukrainians have in their support. So if reading this, you might say, oh, Putin's in good shape. He's not in good shape, and he doesn't have a strategy except that we'll get tired.
Well, the same day, the website of The Hill, a major major web publication on Congress, featured an article as Why Republicans Are Souring on Ukraine, featuring the fact that there is now a significant number of Republican representatives who are voting against aid to Ukraine. A Republican presidential candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, has criticized the Ukrainian government as undemocratic, corrupt, and persecuting Christians, and that we should cut off aid. Donald Trump, who is now the front runner for the Republican nomination and also the front runner in the election, has said that he would settle the war within a day, more or less accepting probably the loss of territory for Ukraine. All of this must figure in Ukrainians' calculation.
All of this figures in Putin loves every statement. Putin loves to hear that there is discord in the United States, that there's a small portion of the Republican Party, of one of the two parties. Putin loves that. That's what he's hoping. That's what I'm telling you. He wants there to be a drop in support for Ukraine. That's what he's after. That's what he's after. And I'll tell you, the other thing, Professor, you want to finish your question. I interrupted.
That's all right.
I apologize.
Well, I wanted to ask you whether the politics of Ukraine, the question that it may become an issue between the parties, or that in fact it might become a central question in the presidential campaign. How can that either be affected? What should the United States or what should the Biden administration be doing now to head that off?
So everything you said again is absolutely true. That is, there is a larger number of Congress people who are willing to vote against aid to Ukraine than there has been in the past. In the past, it's been about 5 people, and so now but there are more, and so the trend is not right in terms of that. However, when you look at the votes in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and when you look at the statements coming from congressmen and senators, it is clear that there is bipartisan support for aid to Ukraine in both the House and the Senate. Lock solid in the Senate. I mean, in the Senate there are a couple of senators who oppose this, and you can count them on the fingers of kind of one hand. In the House, there are tens of and even 20s but they are in the minority, and there's if you took a vote today on the floor of the House, the assistance to Ukraine would pass. If you took a vote on the Senate, it would pass overwhelmingly. When you take polls in the United States, asking what people think, 60% of the Americans, depending on the poll, support aid to Ukraine. Now, they will say, you will say, Professor, that yeah, that's true, but it's down. Yeah, it is down. It's down from like 80% before, and it's now down to 60. Nonetheless, 60% of American support for this, and there's bipartisan support in the Congress. You raised the presidential election. The quotes that you just gave again come right out of the Kremlin. I mean, this is exactly the Kremlin line. That the Ukrainians, the Kremlin, Putin says that Ukraine is corrupt. He says it's being run by Nazis. He says President Zelensky, Jewish by birth, is a Nazi. And he tried that, it didn't work, and so he's kind of dropped that. But this is exactly what President Putin is trying to do. It's his only strategy.
Well, you know, though, that one of the problems in terms of eliciting support is that many of the non-aligned countries, large non-aligned countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, have not been fully supportive of Ukraine, and in fact have basically benefited in some ways from some of the sanctions. How, in the piece that you wrote back in September, you mentioned the need to try and change non-aligned opinion. Do you think that's possible these days?
I do think it's possible. I'm not sure it's critical. What's critical is our support for Ukraine. The non-aligned, the rest of the world, other parts of the world. So as I've mentioned, Europe, United States, Far East, our allies, our democratic allies, our strong market allies, strong support. Well over half the GDP of the world is supporting Ukraine. Now, it is true that the Brazilians are not supporting. And Ukraine's worried about that. They would like to have the Brazilians, but we have some people from Brazil in the room. But if the Brazilians don't support, it's not critical. If the South Africans don't support, it's not critical. It would be good for the Brazilians and the South Africans and the Indonesians and the Egyptians and the Saudis. It would be good for them to recognize that they are better off in a world where big, strong nations don't invade other nations, where heavily armed neighbors don't invade poorly armed neighbors. They are better off. All nations are better off in a world where their sovereignty is respected, their borders are respected. I think it would be good for them. It's not critical. What's critical is our support for Ukraine to enable them to win this war.
Well, one of the points that the Russian writer mentioned, and certainly on a lot of people's minds, is the fact that the war in Gaza has taken American attention, mostly now directed toward the Middle East and away from Ukraine. It's also, of course, had an impact on perceptions of the United States in parts of the world that many have argued has hurt the United States' case, even if, again, Americans feel strongly in support of Israel. Nevertheless, the whole question of another war breaking out and the question of binding the assistance to Israel with Ukraine came up, of course, in the House. How do you see the impact of the Gazan war on this question of support for Ukraine?
There's no doubt. There's no doubt that the attack on October 7th, Hamas on Israel, has focused the attention, rightly so, on that part of the world. It has focused attention which had faded. For a long time there was a whole lot of effort devoted to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and there was a lot of attention, thought, writing, energy behind coming up with a solution to that problem. 2 states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace. But that had fallen off. So what has happened now, since October 7th, and everything that's followed, has been a renewed interest in how to solve that problem, which, again, of course you're right. We all have a limited ability to focus on many things. I mean, we can focus on a couple of things, but when we're focusing on Israel-Palestine, the Middle East, we're focusing less on Ukraine. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. That said, we can do both. That said, we can continue to support Ukraine, even while we are trying to solve that problem in the Middle East.
Recently in the Wall Street Journal, Walter Russell Mead criticized the Biden administration for, as he put it, quote, being more interested in avoiding confrontation with Russia rather than defeating it. Is that your perception of what the Biden administration's policies have been, or would you defend the administration on this issue?
No, I don't think the administration, and I don't think the administration's goal is to defeat Russia. The administration's goal, and frankly the Ukrainian goal, which we support, is for Ukraine to exist in its internationally recognized borders that they've enjoyed since 1991, since they became independent of the Soviet Union. That's a win. Winning for Ukraine, and what we are supporting them to, is just to get the Russians out of their country. It's that simple. Just get the Russians out. It'd be easy to say. And right now, they occupy 18 to 20%. The Russians occupy 18 to 20%. So, and that's what the administration has pushed. Now, that's different from defeating Russia. It's different. And if it happens, if it does, if the Ukrainians do succeed pushing the Russians out, it's not good for President Putin. It's not good for President Putin, and he is likely to lose his job one way or the other. We can think about how that might happen. Some smart people have kind of given a lot of thought to how that might happen, but he might. But that's not our position. That's not anything that we can affect. That's not what the administration is after, regime change. No, it's very simple. Get the Russians out of the sovereign country of Ukraine.
Although, and I don't mean to, the administration has been very careful about what types of weapons and weaponry to go.
True.
With the result, of course, that you might get something of a stalemate, and a stalemate in the American political system is usually difficult to maintain political support. So in effect, their policies may cripple the possibility of a Ukrainian.
So I would agree with that, and I would urge the administration, and have urged the administration, many people have, to do more faster. If we want this war to end, if we want the Ukrainians to win, we need to provide them with what they need. You are exactly right, and Walter Russell Mead is also right. Others have made this point over and over, that we took too long to make decisions about what weapons to give to the Ukrainians. And we dithered and we wrung our hands about whether, what will the Russians think, or what will they do if we give them this weapon system? And then we gave them that weapon system, then the Russians did. And then we gave them the next, what would they do if we gave them this HIMARS artillery? Oh, the Russians might get upset about this, who knows what, they didn't, we gave it to them. Then tanks, maybe the Russians will really get upset if we give the Ukrainians tanks. No, we gave them tanks, the F-16s, that decision has been made. We've even given them the longest range weapons that we have, not quite the longest range, the longest systems that can go the long range. And again, there was concern in the administration. They went too slow, I totally agree. But they have now figured it out that they can continue to provide these weapons. And that's what they're doing. It's too slow, I will grant you that.
Do you think there's any realistic possibility of a settlement whereby Russia would actually admit and provide any type of reconstruction assistance to Ukraine?
I'm glad you asked, though I'm very glad you asked. The question is, let me rephrase the question to make it easier to answer. Will the Russians pay for reconstruction? Yes, and here's how. It turns out several of you have heard this story before, so I will tell it anyway, because some of you haven't. So President Putin, when he was thinking about whether or not to invade Ukraine, thought he would probably be subject to sanctions. He knew what happened. President Biden actually called President Putin and said, if you invade Ukraine, we're going to put the sanctions on like you've never seen before. Putin knew that was coming. President Biden probably thought he could deter. Well, he didn't. They were never. But Putin thought he could withstand sanctions because he had $600 billion of reserves in his central bank, in the Russian central bank. He had $600 billion. The problem is, half of that $600 billion, so $300 billion, are in Western banks, are in G7 banks. And those $300 billion, half of the 600 that he thought he had, are frozen. Putin can't get at those. And all we have to do is seize those 300 billion that are in Western banks and put it into an international fund managed by, the Europeans or the World Bank with the Ukrainians. And that can go a long way to reconstructing Ukraine. The estimates are that it's going to take at least $500 billion to repair the damage that the Russians have caused. $500 billion. $300 billion are already in our banks. So I'm glad you asked this question.
I'm almost at the point where I want to open it up now to student questions, particularly, and we have a hard end at around 7:30. So we'd like to see if any of you would like to ask questions of the ambassador. Do we have we have one out there? Yes.
Yes, as you know, Wagner failed its coup attempts earlier this year, and when Wagner got exiled to Belarus, Prigozhin died in a plane crash. Do you think we're going to see an offensive in the spring from Wagner forces north of Kyiv?
So the Wagner group, led by Prigozhin, as you indicated, a very good question. Prigozhin, of course, mounted a mutiny against the Kremlin, and was halfway up the road toward the Kremlin when he decided that he wasn't getting the support he thought he was going to get. So he stopped. And Putin that day panicked in the beginning. He woke up in the morning and Prigozhin and Wagner, this well-trained, the most successful military unit in Russia, is the only one who's been able to make any significant gains. And all of a sudden, it's pulled out of Ukraine. Prigozhin pulls Wagner out of Ukraine, goes over and takes over Rostov, which is a military headquarters. No opposition. There was no opposition to this takeover, this mutiny. Indeed, he was greeted as a hero. You probably saw people were taking selfies with Prigozhin on the way to attack Moscow. And Putin panicked. Putin came out and said, "This is treason. This, stab in the back. We're going to have to crush them." And by the end of the day, Putin had made a deal with Prigozhin. And then you're right. A couple of months later, after Prigozhin was kind of going around the country, flying in his own jet, all of a sudden his jet explodes on the way from Moscow to St. Petersburg. He dies along with a lot of his. This is a long answer to your question. I don't think so. I don't think that there will be a Wagner mutiny again, because Wagner, so they learned, Putin learned, and the military learned, there's not a good idea to have these independent private military companies. It was a bad idea because they couldn't control them, and he saw the results. So they have disbanded and dispersed the Wagner troops and units back into the military, and the military is starting to take them over. So I don't think you'll see that. Now, that demonstrated there's a fragility in the military chain of command, in the Russian military chain of command. That if that can happen, it can happen again. Prigozhin probably stopped because he thought that he was going to have support. When he took off and headed north toward Moscow from Rostov, he thought he was going to have support, and you know, he had some reason to think so. There were a couple of generals that we know of who must have told Prigozhin, "We'll support you," and they didn't. And when he saw that they didn't, he stopped. But those generals are an indication that Putin's got problems. He's not sure who's loyal, who's not. He's fired some of those. He's moved some around. The military chain of command in Russia is fragile. So I don't expect them. I don't think Wagner, but Putin knows he's got a problem. Yeah.
So you talked about Ukraine needing the support of, especially the United States. You said we should give them what they need. I was wondering if in that statement you would include even mobilizing your own troops and supporting in more of like a present way. And if so, if you could explicate a couple of the reasons as to why that would be necessary.
It's not necessary. It's not necessary. The Ukrainians have not asked for any NATO troops, no American troops. There are no American troops on the ground in Ukraine. The support that we are providing is significant, but it's 5%. The military support we're providing to Ukraine is 5% of our military budget. Our defense budget is about $850 billion, and we're providing some $45 billion. A lot of money, let's be clear, but that's 5% of our defense budget, and we, without a soldier in Ukraine, without any of our soldiers in Ukraine, they're not asking for it. And the Ukrainians have degraded one of our two main enemies, challengers. I mean, the Russians are clearly our enemies. The Chinese are at least a threat. Of those two, which accounts for our defense budget being $850 billion, 5% of that is doing great damage to one of those two enemies. The enemy that is the most immediate threat, the enemy that is actually killing people by the tens of thousands. And the Ukrainians are holding them off for 5% of our defense budget. So they're not asking for our soldiers. They're asking for the tools, the weapons, so that they can succeed in what they're trying to do. Just get the Russians out of their country.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is there, no. Yes, over here.
So my question is, I really hear you and I agree that I wish they would do it more and faster so we don't just string this war along forever, which I think Putin's counting on. But who is controlling for this country the money that's going over there? Because there's so much talk about there is corruption in Ukraine, there's corruption in this country. People are worried how much of that money is going in other people's hands. Zelensky's wife, you hear that? Is that just a rumor? You don't know. But it's not good out there if you want to keep the support going.
You're absolutely correct. And no one knows that better than the Ukrainians. So I mentioned, I've been there a lot during this war. And I talked to a lot of people in the government, out of the government. I talked to soldiers, I talked to civilians. The first thing, when they know, many of them know me at this point, but the first thing when they're talking to any American, the first thing they'll say is, thank you. You say, thank you for what you're doing. And the second thing is, we need more. And they know that for them to get more, or to even keep what's now coming, they know that we have to trust them. They know that very, very well. The Ukrainians want to be very sure that every bullet gets to the front line. The support for their troops, Ukrainian support for their troops, is overwhelming and is genuine and is heartfelt in every family. So in every village, they are supporting their troops, and they don't want. And there have not been reports of diversion of arms. Number one. Number two. The professor talked about this article in the newspaper today. This one by a Russian. There's another op-ed piece that gets exactly to your question about where's this money going. Turns out that this 5% of the defense budget that I mentioned, this $45 billion, is actually going to U.S. workers, going to U.S. factories. I don't know if you read this, but take a look in it's in the Washington Post today. A man named Mark Thiessen, and he's done a lot of research on where the money goes, in particular this weapons money. And it turns out that when we provide weapons, just as an example, if we provide ammunition for artillery weapons in Ukraine, we take these rounds out of stocks and we send them to Ukraine. And what we need to do is buy more. And the people, the companies, the firms, the manufacturing companies that are making those rounds are Americans. And they're in Ohio, and he's maps. There's great maps of where all these factories are. And he points out, he's a careful political observer, and he notices that of the small number of senators who don't support the sending weapons to Ukraine, a couple of that small number are from places where there are factories that are benefiting from the supplies going to Ukraine, because they are replacing so there's no worry about corruption there. And the cash that we provide goes to the World Bank. And the World Bank meters it, monitors it, accounts for it through their mechanisms. And there have been no allegations that I've seen. I may not have read everyone, but I've read a lot. There's been no allegations of any of the international assistance being going to corrupt places. What there have been is there have been arrests made of, like, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was arrested, caught red-handed, taking bribes from other Ukrainians for a favorable opinion coming out, and the system, the anti-corruption system that the Ukrainians have put in place to be sure that they maintain our trust, that system worked. And it caught this Chief Justice. There were a couple of deputy defense ministers who were also accused of, and will soon be tried, for corruption on buying eggs at elevated prices. And this great reporter in Ukraine went out to the market, figured out how much eggs were being sold for, looked at the contracts that the Ukrainian government, Ministry of Defense, what they were paying, and they were paying a lot more, and somebody was making some money. There's no foreign assistance in that. That's corruption in. Now, the other thing I always point out when this issue of corruption comes up is all countries have this problem. There is a congressman today in Washington who's about to be kicked out of Congress for being so corrupt and using, you know what I'm talking about here, so corrupt and using his constituents' monies for just amazing stuff. This is also the guy who said that he had Holocaust survivors in his ancestry. It's all lies. So we have this problem. We have a senator from New Jersey who is accused of corruption as well. All to say that this is a common problem, and what you need to do is deal with it. And the Ukrainians know that. They've got systems in place now that are dealing with this problem. So last thing, I'm glad you asked this question too, because this gives me an opportunity to make this point, because it comes up a lot. It comes up a lot. And we do need to trust them. We do need to have confidence that the money that we are putting in there, 5% of our defense budget, is not being ripped off. And we have that confidence. Transparency International does a report every year, and it measures, for all the countries around the world, perception of corruption. And you don't want to be at the bottom, so they have like 200. And you want to be at the top, the least corrupt are at the top. We're not actually at the very top. There are some Scandinavian countries that are right up at the top, but we're down a little bit, but we're still towards the top. Ukraine in 2014, before the Russians invaded, was way down. It was down like 160 out of 200. Let's be clear, the Russians are always worse than Ukrainians. They are much more corrupt than any other nation in Europe. But the Ukrainians were at 160. Now, with this effort that I mentioned in putting in place these anti-corruption measures, they're up at 116. Still not great, but they've been improving a lot and doing it, and they're going in the right direction. So I am comfortable. I'm going to have this conversation with your son and his, on this whole thing of corruption. This is a very interesting question that people should be asking this question.
Yeah, sir, first of all, thank you for speaking tonight, and thank you for your service. 40 years is remarkable. So, 2012, 2013, President Obama famously declared a red line against the Assad regime regarding the use of chemical weapons. When that red line was not adhered to, some of the narratives claimed that Putin was actually emboldened by that and sent Russian troops and advisors to the Assad regime. Now, of course, Assad in Syria is not comparable to the global threat that Putin possesses to the world. But do you think, or is there an unspoken red line now in the Biden administration that would prevent or a plan in place for further Russian escalation and our response, say, if Kyiv is surrounded, something like that? I mean, of course, it would be unspoken at this point, but is there anything like that, or do you think there should be a red line?
So I have resisted the notion of red lines, mainly on the Russian side, for reasons that I talked about earlier. I mean, you know, we've gone up the ladder in terms of what kind of weapons and we were always worried about red lines. And it turns out there were no red lines. And you make the good point about the Obama administration in Syria and chemical weapons. You either have to, abide by them, or don't make the case. I mean, don't make the promise that you'll do something if you're not going to do it. But another concern, not a red line, but another indication that Putin took as an encouragement was our withdrawal from Afghanistan. So when we withdrew from Afghanistan, Putin looked at that, others too, and said, the Americans, they must not have the stomach. They must not have the staying power. So Putin, I can take more risks. I can be a little more aggressive. President Xi in China has probably noticed the same thing. And he has said, the Chinese have said, that the Americans' time has passed, that they're on the decline, we're on the rise. And when they saw the Afghanistan pull out, they said, and so they've noticed, both President Putin and President Xi, that without setting red lines, the Biden administration and the Americans, the U.S. government, and the American people have said, we're standing with the Ukrainians. We're standing with the Ukrainians. And Putin probably thought that was not going to happen. Xi is watching very closely to see if we stick with the Ukrainians. If we don't, that'll reinforce his sense the Americans are on decline. They say one thing and they don't follow through. And he then be more likely to go into Taiwan. So without going into the red line business, I think the demonstrated strength that the administration of the United States has presented to, in the first instance, strength against this, in support of Ukraine against the Russian invasion, is a strong signal. Red line or not, I'm not sure about red lines. But that, if we drop the ball, if we get tired, if we crack, if we stop supporting, then we're running into the problem that you identified.
Can I follow up and
Please.
just ask you whether you think that in the event that the Ukrainians broke through and were threatening essentially to win the war,
Yep.
Putin might use nuclear weapons?
So we have to be worried about that. Deterrence, the way we have deterred the use of nuclear weapons since 1945 has been to ensure that no one sees it as making any sense. we've deterred anyone's use. They've deterred us, we've deterred them, that's been successful. That can still work, and indeed, in answer to this very question, our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, made a public statement to the Russians and said, if you use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, you will face, and he used these words, catastrophic consequences. In a very clear message to deter the use of nuclear weapons by the Russians in Ukraine. Now, he didn't say what those catastrophic consequences would be, and no one believes that it would be a nuclear response. Jake Sullivan, US government is not threatening to use nuclear weapons. What we're threatening to do is, this maybe get to your question about what we would do in certain circumstances, is if they were to use nuclear weapons, there would have to be a response. There would have to be a response, and that response would be, in the first instance, conventional, that is not nuclear, and it would be aimed at the military capability that use those weapons. And the United States government, at the top level, the National Security Advisor to the President has said there will be catastrophic consequences. And the Chinese have said to Putin, shut up. Putin has been making this, bluff, this saber rally. Don't forget, I've got nuclear weapons, he said a couple times. And his people say it as well. Don't forget, I'm going to move him around, he says, just to remind us that he's good. And the Chinese have said, shut up. And he has. He has calmed that down. We haven't heard that kind of talk in months. And maybe it's due to Jake Sullivan saying, or maybe it's due to President Xi saying, shut up.
We have time for one more question. Right here.
And I've got time afterwards. If anybody wants to stick around, I'm happy to continue. Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to thank you for being here and your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed your insight. Second, I have seen some discourse surrounding Russia pivoting towards China as far as an economic partner, as well as a partner in other sorts because of the sanctions from the West. Do you think this is something we should be worried about in this developing Eastern power, or do you think it'll dissolve?
So that's a great question. It's a great question. And it is true that the Russians now need the Chinese. So it used to be, when we were growing up, in the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union, and then the Chinese. Kind of very big brother and very little brother. And the Communist Party here looked at the Communist Party. It's flipped. The Chinese are clearly the dominant power in that pair, number one. And the Russians are uncomfortable with that. The Chinese are actually pretty comfortable with that arrangement. The Russians are not. So it's not clear how stable that is going to be. But number two, the Russians have gone to the Chinese and asked for weapons and asked for help getting around specific sanctions that we've put on, like microchips. And the Chinese have said no. They said, we're not going to violate the sanctions to help you out, and we're not going to provide you with weapons. As I said, the Russians can buy weapons from two places, Iran and North Korea, that's it. No one else is at least that we can tell, is selling weapons to them. So, and then the last question is, the relationship between the United States and China and the relationship between the United States and Russia is very interesting. So I live in Washington, I work in Washington right now, and I will tell you there are two views about China in that city. And the Biden administration has one view that says, we're going to have to talk to these folks. And we saw President Xi and President Biden in San Francisco, they had this meeting, and we've seen other cabinet ministers go back and forth and have these conversations. So the Biden administration's view is that, they are a challenge. It doesn't have to be a war. We should be prepared, and we should support Taiwan, but there doesn't have to be a war. That's one view. The other view, which I will tell you, is more broadly held, more widely held, and it's Republicans and Democrats in Congress who are so anti-China that they believe that the Chinese are preparing to attack, and that this is the extreme view, some people don't hold it, that we should go first, that we should preempt so that they don't attack. Again, that's the extreme view. Not many people, but there are strong views about how hostile we should be, supporting hostility toward the Chinese. The administration, the Biden administration is not there. So then the question gets back to your question about the Chinese-Russian relations. And if the United States can have some kind of a relationship, be able to talk to the Chinese, we're not talking to the Russians. The Russians have demonstrated it's not worth talking to them. They told the world in January of 2022, there's no chance that we're going to invade Ukraine. They said this. They said the Westerners are hysterical. They think we're going to invade. We're not going to invade Ukraine. February they invaded Ukraine. So there's no sense it makes little to no sense to be talking to them about almost anything. And we're not. We're talking to the Chinese. And if we can have that, we can develop that relationship, I think that will enable us to contain the Russians over time.
Well, we're at this point, but the ambassador is going to be here for a little bit longer and be more than happy to take more questions. Let me just thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to talk about this.